So in Berkeley's three dialogues, Hylas, the avowed materialist and realist, finds his position eventually demolished by Philonous, Berkeley's mouthpiece. So how does this go about? Hylas first begins by asserting his confidence in the reality of things just as they are perceived. Objects in the world around us, outside of our own minds, exist independently in and of themselves, and their resemblances of what we perceive. We see them as they actually are in themselves. The heat, the color, the shape, everything about those objects is just the way it looks to us. So this is a position that is usually called today naive realism. This is a term that is used in philosophy. It doesn't occur in Berkeley's writings, but Hylas is adopting initially a position that we call today naive realism. He will soon abandon this position. It's naive because it's assuming that the way things are in themselves is exactly the way that we perceive them. If you think about it for a moment, from what you know or what you believe about perception, you certainly believe that light is reflected off of objects and it enters the eye and it's processed somehow by the brain and we perceive colors. Right? So the colors that we happen to perceive are a result of the way that the brain interacts with the stimulus that we receive through the eye and the optic nerve in a way. So it does seem kind of naive to suppose that the red apple, that the red is sort of really in the apple, something in the apple, the way that we perceive it in our minds. Notice we can ask ourselves a question that was quite popular to contemplate around the time of Locke and Berkeley, namely whether or not we could know that any two of us perceive actually subjectively the same thing when we perceive red. You know, for all we know, we could perceive subjectively completely different things. We could each have completely different experiences of the color red and nevertheless still agree about the things that we call red as long as our experiences are consistent. Or for that matter, does what we perceive agree with what, say, a dog perceives or other animals? Well, we can be fairly confident because of the difference in the retinal structures of the different animals with eyes that we don't all perceive things exactly the same way. And so how are we to be so confident the world somehow in itself, independently of our minds, is the way that it appears to us? But we are kind of born realists. You know, we're born to assume that the world is the way we perceive it and that we're perceiving reality, you know, whatever that is. And so, consequently, this is the position that Hylas begins with. Berkeley makes fairly quick dispatch with this position. Philonous demolishes Hylas's position, his naive realism, fairly quickly, with a couple of arguments. And it's a pattern of argument that he's going to repeat again in other contexts, in other parts of the dialogues as well. Hylas begins with heat and cold. He believes, you know, hot things are really hot and cold things are really cold. And Philonous makes the observation that when we perceive heat or when we perceive cold, especially if we perceive, say, an extreme heat or something that's extremely cold, that this is quite painful. Now, pain and pleasure, unlike maybe heat, hot and cold, are things that just sort of commonsensically, intuitively, naively, we don't attribute to the objects that cause them in us. So we may think that the fire is hot, and if we stick our hand in it, it will also certainly hurt, but we don't think that the fire itself is in pain. Philonous argues now that the pain that we perceive and the heat that we perceive is one and the same sensation. We can't distinguish between those. So on what grounds, he then asks Hylas, can we say that the heat is something that really is in the fire, but the pain, on the other hand, isn't? The pain is just in our minds, but not in the fire itself. There's one other argument that he uses, and he uses this argument for many, many different instances pertaining to all of the senses. And this is a kind of a relativity argument, something that I just briefly sketched out to you without actually attributing it to Berkeley. And this is about the relativity of perception. Do we perceive things the same way as each other? Do we perceive things the same way that other animals do? So we perceive colors, even if we perceive colors in exactly the same way, one with each other, human with human, can we be sure that we perceive colors the same way that a dog does, or an elephant, or a mite, or a flea for that matter? On the contrary, we can be pretty sure that we do not. Since perception is relative to the perceiver, the quality of what we perceive, those qualities of what we perceive are relative to the perceiver, is different in different animals and perhaps also in different individuals. It doesn't make sense to say that any one of those types of perceptions is privileged and that this is the real object of perception. This is the perception of how things are in themselves, rather than the way that our mind receives this. And so Hylas is soon going to abandon this position. Now, before we leave this particular argument, one more thing to think about briefly is what does this have to do with the question of realism, meaning realism about the material world, versus idealism, the question of whether or not matter actually exists. Remember that matter here for us, what we're talking about in this context, must be understood in the context of an empiricist. Berkeley, like Locke, is not going to accept that something like extension is an innate idea that we are born with, an a priori principle hardwired, so to speak, into our own minds. Everything that we know must come into our conscious awareness through one of the senses. Everything has to be attributable to sense perception. And so Berkeley will raise the question, right, through the character Philonas, will raise the question, well, what do we perceive of matter? What is this matter that we supposedly perceive? In fact, we don't ever perceive matter. Certainly we perceive bodies. How do we perceive? We perceive bodies because we perceive shapes and colors and textures. And of course we also perceive smells and tastes, things like this. But there isn't anything that we might call matter distinct from the qualities that material things, the sensible qualities that material things have, that we actually perceive. So he's going to push this point again and again, that whatever we call matter is something that is indeed imperceptible. This hypothetical matter is not any of our sensible qualities that we actually perceive. It must be something different. And since we don't actually perceive it, he is going to argue first that it is an unnecessary and a pointless hypothesis to suppose that this unperceived stuff that we want to call matter actually exists, when theoretically we don't need it and we don't have any evidence of it. But beyond that, he's going to make a second argument later on in the dialogues as well. He's going to argue that the very concept of matter is a notion that is inherently self-contradictory. So not only do we not have any evidence of the existence of matter, we do have a demonstration that the very idea of matter is a self-contradictory notion, so there couldn't actually be any such thing as matter. So since whatever evidence we have that we use as a basis for asserting the existence of physical material objects is contained in the sensible qualities that we perceive, the root of this argument for him is going to start with asserting that sensible qualities are ideas in the mind. They're not anything that exist independently outside of the mind. Hylas will soon draw the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, this distinction that we've seen in Locke, and we'll take a look at this next time.